Everyone, running late. Oh, and the chat isn't up. Isn't that cute? But it's wrong. See. See if we can fix that. I seem to be having problems with OBS this morning. Okay, there we go. Right, yeah, I'm running behind because of problems with OBS and firewalls and all the rest of it, and I've got stuff to do. So, let's get on with it. You know the drill. It's morning after the night before. It's the successor to FTGE because that kept running into problems with its name and everything. So, yeah, that was fun. Tends to get demonetized, so if you want to chip in, that'd be lovely. And this is a new channel. I'm putting all my streaming on a separate channel now, so please do subscribe. Right. I'll check your comments at the end, but for now, let's get started, shall we? Okay, that's not causing a problem. Good. Right. Thankfully, the whole PPI compensation scheme thing is coming to an end, so we're going to stop getting these adverts and spam calls and everything asking us will we missold PPI, which is like a payment insurance thing, payment protection insurance. So if you took out a loan or you were doing payments for a thing, you could pay extra and you'd get insurance, and a whole bunch of this was done without getting the proper consent, I guess, from anyone. And so there's been compensation claims for years and years and years. Now, Lloyd's, as we approach the end of this period in which you can claim back the money and compensation and whatever else, Lloyd's has been hit with a 1.8 billion bill as there's been a sudden rush of claims for this missold payment protection insurance. If this is any indication of how it is for other banks and so on, you know, this is a bit of a problem, and it's going to put extra strain on them at a time where we don't really want them to have extra strain, do we? So that's fine. They're going to be losing about 1.2 to 1.8 billion. Now, of course, they shouldn't have missold PPI in the first place, nor should anyone else. RBS is facing nearly £1 billion in charges as well. But yeah, this is extra strain on the banks at a time where we don't particularly need it, and it's just kind of a fascinating insight into human psychology, I suppose, that everyone is suddenly thinking, oh, time's running out. Did I have PPI? Ooh, maybe I should check. And so a whole bunch of predatory firms that are handling these claims, financial ambulance chasers, I don't know what you'd call them exactly. Yeah, they're in this rush to get this last amount of money and to take their slice of it as well for handling all the legal rigmarole for people who are missold. But thankfully that'll soon be over. But I do wonder what all of these firms are going to latch onto next and what's going to happen to the people who've been employed to chase PPI. Questions. Problematic people all the way down. And now, as you know, if you watch the show on the regular, the whole shtick is I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. All I've done is look at the headlines. So I'm just commenting off the top of my head, pulling it all out of my arse, which is what most YouTube commentators do. It's like a satire, you see. But I do actually know a little bit about this next topic. Solar panels. Now, thousands of people who've had solar panels fitted, they get loans to do it, and they get certain subsidization from the government, or did for a while, and they get these solar panels put on their roof. Supposedly they'll save loads and loads of money on electricity costs, and even make them money by generating power, during off periods. But it hasn't really paid out in the way that they thought it would. Now I know. This is Britain. Right, we're known for our clouds, not for our sunshine. But Germany, which has weather that's not particularly different to us, all things considered, they do really well with solar. So there's no reason why Britain shouldn't do well with solar, though we'd probably be better off going with wind. You can get these fairly small home wind turbines, but getting planning permission is a lot more difficult here for those than solar panels. I know, I've looked into it. But people haven't got the savings or the payouts that they've been promised, and the Financial Services Ombudsman has had over 2,000 complaints. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it is quite a lot, really, and it looks like there's going to be a bunch of claims about that. Not exactly PPI level, but quite a lot of claims. What seems to have happened here is that people have been sold on a promise that isn't accurate, and the efficiency of these solar panels goes down over time, and a lot of these are older solar panels that aren't as efficient as the more modern ones, and there's technology coming along that is going to make solar panels about a third again as effective. So it's a technology for the future, so early adopters do tend to get screwed over with any kind of technology, and also because of various schemes and businesses and so on, banks and the government that's been involved in this, it's all gone to the kind of cheapest side of things, which hasn't been particularly helpful for anyone. And a lot of these solar firms that sprung up to take advantage of all these loans and the subsidies and so on, a lot of them have gone bankrupt as that money has been taken away. So supposedly you would be about £30,000 better off over 20 years when you bought these panels. It's all very persuasive. Everyone wants to be green and to help the planet and all the rest of it. This example guy who was told he would save 30,000, he took out a loan of 15,000, but the panels didn't generate the amount of electricity he was promised, also overheated, damaging the equipment, and they've cost him more than £500 a year, not really helped him particularly, and the company that fitted his solar panels has gone bankrupt as well. A lot of corner cutting and so on. What upsets me about this is it's going to sour a lot of people on the idea of doing this, which is not helpful to anyone or the planet or anything else. So, unfortunately, a lot of these schemes aren't the best way to go about it, and you should probably shop around, learn, check out websites and so on, communities that deal with green energy, home home-powered green energy and so on, and find the best option and get that, rather than following along in these deals that some banks and building societies and government schemes are allowing. And really, wind is probably a better bet. If you watch any of Thunderfoot's videos, he talks about how important placement of solar panels is. So ideally you want them to be placed in such a way as they get the most sun, and they get the most sun at the right angle, and I suspect a lot of people fitting these things aren't doing it properly, which is a problem with a one-size-fits-all solution. But yeah, windmills, if you can get the planning permission, much better bet. And also you can get those dual purpose solar panels that heat water as well. That might be a better bet as well, because then you'll save money heating water, which is one of the primary costs in housing these days. Moving on. Hurricane Dorian has hit the Bahamas really hard. There have been mass evacuations, a shitload of damage, more than is usual, and big parts of the island chain have been devastated. Fortunately, it seems to be losing power as it approaches the States, and shouldn't be too much of a problem, especially since my partner is off to the States, to Florida, in fact, this week. So, yeah, hopefully everything's okay by then. There's been a ton of deaths, still not sure exactly how many, so no one's reporting on those particularly, but 70,000 people have been displaced just in the Bahamas, which doesn't have a huge population in the first place. This was a Category 5 hurricane with wind gusts of 300 kilometers an hour, 200 miles per hour, and huge storm surges, which has really hit people really hard. Now, there is a really good response going on, despite Trump's grandstanding about the whole thing. But militias have formed, there's looting, people are siphoning petrol out of cars that have been destroyed to get other cars moving. There's no medicine, very little clean water, and there isn't enough help. So if you can find a reputable charity that is involved in the relief effort there, now would be a good time to give some money. I have to... who did I give it to? God, I can't remember now. There was some unreputable UN something, or I may have even given to, was it UK, US Agency for International Development is doing some stuff, and I think there's some options for them, and there's some options for direct donations to some of the governments in some of the government agencies and so on in the Bahamas, which is probably the best bet to get help on the ground. So yeah, horrible business, and things like that are going to get worse. I just bought The Uninhabitable Earth, which is supposedly a really, really good read on exactly how bad climate change could get. I'll probably do a review of it once I've finished reading it. But it's been compared to what's it, Silent Spring, which was a big influence on those kind of 70s and 80s environmental movements. I'm raiding it for post-apocalyptic inspiration for games primarily, which is kind of how I deal with horrible things like that. But so far, very good read, very sobering. People talk about climate change hysteria. It isn't really, and hurricanes and storms and things like this are going to get worse. We're going to get more of them. They're going to get stronger because there's more heat in the system. And just because there's heat doesn't mean that there won't be more snow or cold in some regions. Climate change is change and unpredictability and energy in the system. But every time we get something like this, and it is particularly devastating and worse than ones that have gone before, we're seeing that cranking up slowly. But it's the whole boiled frog thing. That's apocryphal and not actually true. But as an analogy, as a way to understand psychology and how we respond to these things, I think it is useful. All right, slow change we kind of adapt to and move with to an extent, but we don't realize there's a crisis until things get really bad. And all the experts are telling us that it's going to get really bad, and maybe we could stave this off a little if we do something now. We're going to have to adapt now. It's too late with that massive geoengineering and high-tech approaches to the problem. But yeah, we don't tend to do anything until we're already in crisis mode, by which point, with this kind of thing, it's probably going to be too late. Not that there aren't big technological solutions like orbital solar shaders, things like that, but it's the whole planet, and we're balkanized. We have lots of different governments, and any changes that we make will affect everyone if we engage in geoengineering. And getting everyone to cooperate is not easy. British Airways has begun a 2-day strike over payment and compensation. Over the last couple of decades, really, there's been a huge downward pressure on pilots' wages, and they've been expected to do more and more work. This has led to strikes and actions and unionisation and so on in some of the smaller operators, the budget airlines like EasyJet and so on. But this is the first time it's hit BA, and I think this is the first time that BA's pilots have ever gone on strike. I think cabin crew have before, but yeah, here it is. This is the first time British Airways pilots have walked out, and the action could cost the airline up to £40 million per day. Some 4,000 pilots will strike, and almost all of the 1,600 flights that were due to fly through BA will be grounded. So if you use BA, don't. A childhood friend of mine, his father was a pilot for BA, and it was a really kind of prestigious and very well paid job at the time. He was frightfully middle class. Of course, back then it was at the start, at least, it was the national airline. Then it got privatized along with everything else, and it's very much always been a prestige airline, a bit more expensive, but you get better service and better stuff handed out to you and so on. We used to get the spare leftover kits with the wings and the mini soap and shampoo and the sleeping masks and everything, which we cut holes in to make superhero masks. Things like that. It's just it just kind of shows how bad the whole industry there, the airline industry, has unfortunately become. Okay, moving swiftly on, a lot to get through. Do leave a comment so I know people are watching, though this does record, obviously. Speaking of strikes and unions, the TUC has called for a ban on class discrimination at work. Now, I picked out this story for a few reasons. I think Americans often confuse race and class discrimination, and to be fair, there's an awful lot of overlap in that particular Venn diagram. But looking at sort of British class relations, British race relations, really kind of serves as an example that you can give Americans to show what's really happening in their country, in my not so humble left-wing opinion. And I can't remember the other reason I picked it out. Okay. If you live in Britain, class, it's not as important as it used to be, but it is really important. And there are certain indicators of what class you are. If you speak with a regional accent rather than received pronunciations, BBC English or estuary English, that's kind of it's a mix of received pronunciation and a sort of London softened Cockney, Mockney accent that runs down into Kent and Sussex and a lot of the southern kind of southern counties. Right, those are acceptable forms of accent. But if you have a regional accent, even in one of those counties that's more regional, like in Hampshire, we drop our A's, so it's Hampshire. We're Hampshire Ogs. If you happen to live out in the country, it's not quite as strong as Somerset, but it's pretty strong, right? So if you've got a regional accent, particularly a northern regional accent, somewhere like Lancashire or Yorkshire or Birmingham, then you're considered to be uneducated and low class, right? Because those areas up north have traditionally been more farming and industry, coal mining, steel working, all that kind of thing. Or in more recent years, I say recent, I guess I'm pretty old now. So since the Thatcher era, mass unemployment, criminality, that sort of thing. So something like a Liverpool accent is associated with thieves. It's unfortunate, but what it is, the root cause of all of it is class discrimination. Discrimination against the poor. And in the UK, there's modes of dress, there's accents. Accents is the big giveaway. Certain turns of phrase and things that give you away as coming from a region or being poorer, and that's what gets you prejudice. Now, I think in the States, what people think is racial prejudice is a lot of the time class prejudice, because being black or Hispanic or whatever is associated with poverty, because, well, America isn't a particularly socially mobile country. So you get generational poverty in black communities, and they tend to live in the poorer areas, and when you're poor, criminality rises and so on. Or if you've got a Hispanic accent, then you might be an immigrant. Immigrants tend to be poor, to live in poorer areas where there's more crime and so on. And so the stereotype associated there is the same type of stereotype that we have associated with class and with regional accents in the north and so on. And when you see it in Britain and you understand that it's not racist, it's to do with class, I think Americans potentially have a lot to learn from us about that. Now, of course, there is obviously racism as well, but I think a lot of what they think is racism is classism, right? Because people hold many of the same stereotypes and many of the same behaviours and associations with poor white people, whether you're in the UK or the US. And if you look at the stats on criminality and so on, there's not a huge difference between poor white trash and poor black families and so on. So, yeah, the problem is class. The solidarity that we should be having is class, which crosses racial boundaries and so on. But in the States, there is a lot of racial animus, jealousy. Poor whites are told they should hate poor blacks and Hispanics. Poor blacks increasingly are showing racism towards poor Hispanics because they see them as competition, whereas we should be working together and understanding that the enemy isn't other poor people, it's the unfairly rich and the way in which our society is formed. But no, it's much easier to turn people on each other. So the TUC has proposed that firms should be forced to report any gaps in pay between people from different social backgrounds. Not necessarily a fan of that. There is slightly more meritocracy in this area, and we know that things like that end up misreporting and reinforcing things that aren't true, like the gender wage gap. And also there's other factors involved here, like if you go to school in an affluent area in the south, you're more likely to get a good education than someone from a poor inner city area in the north. It's just how it works. Unfortunately, even if you come out with the same grade, you're still going to face the prejudice that you didn't go to a good school. It's unfair, but I don't see how you fix that necessarily, and I don't know how you report on this without falling into the same mistakes that we have about gender discrimination and so on. But I guess it would be interesting. But yeah, if you come from a working class family in the UK, the odds are stacked against you, even if you have merit, because of your accent and so on. But similar to the racial issues in the States, which I think are actually class issues, I don't think you necessarily tackle it by creating preferential treatment or positive discrimination. Instead, I think you need to emphasize that you just need to treat people fairly and equally and on the basis of merit. And I think that's the solution to the problem everywhere. Oh, God. Politics. Not exactly Brexit, which I tend to leave to the end, but in Parliament, you have the Speaker of the House. At the moment, the Speaker of the House is John Bercow, who I keep mispronouncing as Bercrow. for some reason. You'll have seen him on clips and so on shouting, "Order! Order!" very, very loudly. The Speaker of the House is an MP. They stand for election as per normal, right? When they're installed as the Speaker of the House, by tradition, they are not challenged in any future elections. They still stand for election, but it's purely kind of ritualistic. And it's not the law, it's not a matter of, statute or anything that they don't get challenged. It's just a matter of tradition. And Bercow, for whether you like him or hate him, he is an extremely staunch defender of parliamentary democracy. Which is why the current government and the previous government under Theresa May have been running afoul of him so much, because they keep trying to disrespect and do end runs around parliamentary convention, parliamentary procedure, and parliamentary democracy as a whole. And Bercow is very much the British equivalent of a constitutionalist and a parliamentarian. He's a conservative, right? But he very much believes in the kind of rule of law and everything that surrounds Parliament. And so the Conservative parties have been running afoul of him. And so the Tory party, along with everything else that they're completely disrespecting, are now planning to stand a candidate against Bercow in any election that comes along, because they think he's abusing the process and so on. He isn't, right? He is defending parliamentary democracy, the sovereignty of Parliament, right? Whether you agree with him or not, I think you can see that. Whether you find it frustrating that he is allowing procedures that delay or threaten to completely stymie Brexit, I mean, surely you can see that he is just acting in Parliament's interest and reinforcing parliamentary sovereignty and everything else. So he's formally a Tory, but you kind of retire your party affiliation, then you stand, and by convention, nobody challenges you. But this is the trouble with Britain, right? So much of our politics is based on tradition and precedent, but has no force in law. So there is nothing to stop them challenging him. But it is just yet another example of how this government doesn't give two tugs of a dead dog's cock for democracy, or parliament, or representative democracy, or precedent, or tradition, all the things that kind of grease the wheels and keep our Frankenstein constitution running. They don't care about, and this is just yet another example, right? They're not playing the game, right? They're trying to completely undermine our democracy, while at the same time wrapping themselves in the flag and trying to say that they're defending democracy. That's a whole other tirade about Brexit and democracy, but this is just another example. Right? Whether you're frustrated with Bercow or not, he's a parliamentarian, he believes in parliamentary sovereignty, he believes in the traditions and precepts and things that keep everything going in the UK, and a challenge to him in any election is a massive break with tradition and with precedent, and really threatens everything that keeps this whole jumbled mess carrying along. Excuse me a minute, I have to reply to something. It's the only trouble with this new mechanical keyboard, it's very loud. So, fake news. Right. We've heard how Facebook and other social media have had these kind of abortive alliances with various fact checkers and so on. The trouble is, there is a bias, right? You have to work directly against your bias to get to some kind of fairness. I try, right? But I'm just one guy. I can't hire a department or hire an extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing person to sit next to me all day while I work and check everything I do, right? But I try to the extent that I can. The BBC has a charter that keeps it nominally independent from the government and charges it to be neutral. Sometimes this works against it because you'll get someone who's talking about the problems with climate change, for example, and then for the sake of fair and balanced, right, they'll have a climate denier next to them. Whereas, 98% of people with a relevant qualification in science agree that there is a problem with climate change, and then you give them equal voice with the kooks. And that's a problem, and that creates a bias because you're creating this 50-50 thing that isn't representative of reality, right? So there's still problems even with publicly funded, politically independent groups like the BBC. But it's less bad than with Facebook and so on. But they're going to make an effort to fight disinformation. Probably this is somewhat spurred by previous elections in the US and the referendum here and so on. But they're planning to use technological systems working alongside some of the biggest names in journalism and technology to kind of root out or flag up fake news. On the one hand, okay, this could be good. On the other hand, it does tend to lead to censorship and free speech problems and discrimination issues. So I'm a little bit concerned about this, because the examples that they give are things like anti-vaxxers, right? There's direct harm there being caused to people, so that I can understand, go along with, no problem. And then there's stories manufactured to influence elections, which are dodgy. And it's not just the UK referendum or the American elections where this is an issue. Problems have happened in India, Cambridge Analytica, AIG, and other companies have been involved in manipulating information in lots of smaller nations, even before we had the problems around Trump's election or the referendum. So yeah, it's happened other places. It's happening all over the place. How do we tackle it? How do we stop it? But how do we do that without stifling people's free expression? It's a big issue. But so they've held a summit with a whole bunch of different senior groups in tech and journalism. The journalism is part of the problem these days, I think. But the BBC doesn't take the same tack with clickbait and so on that a lot of others do necessarily. It does to an extent because it's still competing, but monetarily it doesn't have to, if you get what I mean. But their plans include an early warning system so that different organisations can let each other know when they find disinformation and genuinely harmful information. They do specifically talk about that. Democratic disruptions also mentioned. That's a bit more thorny, but things like medical disinformation they should be able to jump on. That's good. They want to educate both people in the media, though you'd think with journalism degrees and so on they'd know about ethics and so on, which how long have we been banging on about that? But also, and I think this is important, to create material that educates people on how to digest their media, how to examine it, how to sniff out what's true and not, reminding people to check. I think that's potentially a very useful thing. That's the thing that I would prefer to see funded. I'd like to see media education in schools. I'd like to see critical thinking education in schools. And when I went to college, I did communication studies, which is a laughable non-subject for most people. But it does teach you how to tackle advertising and to check yourself. And this was before the internet was really huge, but that was very useful. I'd love to see that kind of thing taught more. They want to provide more information around elections, to get more information out to people, just how to vote, where to vote, that kind of thing. Not necessarily information on who to vote for, but the other stuff. And increased sharing of information, particularly around elections and key events like that. So, devil's in the detail, but tackling things like anti-vaccination, that seems like a good idea. Conspiracy theories and so on, that seems like a good idea. Sticking with tech, Twitter is testing AI which will intercept, detect, and delete unsolicited nudes. So good news for women, bad news for men, I guess. The project was started by a developer called Kelsey Bressler, who was sent a dick pic. So they're now creating a kind of deep learning AI that will detect nudes. How they'll know if they're unsolicited, I'm not entirely sure. Um, and so we're going to enter into an arms race, penis versus AI, I think. As they mentioned that one of the early systems, that one of the early algorithms that they had, could be tricked if, like, you made a cage of your fingers over your cock, or you wore a cage over your cock, or put glitter on it. You know, things that slightly disrupt the image, but still left it obvious to the human eye what it was, could get past. But now they've apparently fixed that. But yeah, so you're no longer going to get dick pics, ladies, unless you ask for them. Apparently, at least on Twitter. Oi. There's been culls of badgers over here. The link between badgers and TB in cattle is not particularly well established. The culls haven't reduced the levels of TB in cattle, but it's one of those things that a lot of farmers seem to want to do for some reason, is to murder badgers, even when there's no benefit to it. Who knows why? But the methods in which they've taken to controlling badgers, it's not a good way of culling them. They're often left in pain. They're shot. You know, they survive for a while, but then starve because they can't hunt and feed and root around in the way that they used to. So up to a quarter of badgers who are being culled are not being killed humanely, and there's no real benefit to it in any case. So if you like badgers, like I do, I have been enchanted by badgers ever since I went out walking with my grandfather and we saw, it must have been a mother badger and her cubs running along the pathway, all in a neat little row. And I've loved badgers ever since, and I've kept an eye on all this stuff, and it's just pointless cruelty. It really is. Sticking with sad animal stories, there's been an increase in the number of stranded whales around the UK. Now, synchronicity struck because I've been reading about whale graveyards. So when whales and dolphins are washed ashore, what people typically do is drag them inland, bury them in an area, typically dunes, I think, and then just leave them to rot there. It's not particularly a good use. Okay, the health of the oceans has historically been really, really helped by, you know, big cetaceans like whales. Whale poop is really important to the ecosystem, and yet, you know, so many whales have been killed by humans, either directly or indirectly, that it's had a massive negative impact on the whole ecosystem. Dead whales are also really important to the ocean ecosystem. So it strikes me that what we should be doing is towing the corpses out to sea and dropping them off to land on the seabed, where they can provide lots of food for the local sea life, and where the bones can provide, you know, grounds for seaweed, corals, sea sponges, all that kind of thing. So my suggestion would be to tow the bodies back out to sea even when they're dead, right? Because that's what should be happening naturally. Whale strandings, we still don't know why, really. Sticking with nature and science again, we could defeat malaria in a generation if we wanted to. So do we want to? The Gates Foundation does a lot of stuff on this. And malaria is a huge problem, and it's not the only mosquito-borne disease. And as the world heats up, mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects move north. So this could be a model for the northern hemisphere to deal with these things. And we got the money to do it in a way that the southern hemisphere perhaps doesn't. So to put this in some kind of perspective, every year there are more than 200 million cases of malaria. And those who are killed by it are mostly young children, and other people have to live their lives with it. It can be quite hard to eradicate, and there are versions of the parasite that are extremely resistant to the kind of treatments that we normally do. We could wipe out malaria at the expenditure of about $2 billion in annual funding. Surely globally we can do that, right? Surely we can manage that. $2 billion globally, that's not much at all. Surely the UN could spearhead that, get various nations to cover it. The US alone could cover that pretty goddamn easily, and that would do wonders for its relations with the world as a whole, right? So this is a parasite that lives in the mosquito. Only the female mosquito. Male mosquitoes don't suck blood, right? And once it gets into you, it infects your liver and your red blood cells and causes problems like anemia, all kinds of other things. So how do we prevent it, right? We've tried in the past with mass spraying of DDT and so on, and that just caused more problems. Fairly cheaply, as it turns out. There's some high-tech solutions, but they're not particularly expensive. But other things, just like insecticide-treated mosquito nets, sonic things that annoy mosquitoes and send them away, but which people are virtually unaware of. There's an idea of genetically modifying mosquitoes, breeding mass numbers of them, so that they're basically immune to the parasite, and then releasing them into the wild so they'll interbreed with the wild population, and help out there. There's an improved vaccine that's being rolled out, but you have to do this all in one go, right? You have to wipe it out so that there's no real chance for it to adapt and bounce back. And yeah, insect life cycles are pretty quick, and parasite life cycles are pretty quick. There's a new genetically modified fungus that kills something like 99% of malaria mosquitoes as well, which they're testing. That's really useful. So we currently spend globally about $4.3 billion, so it would cost about $6.3 billion. And the application of a lot of these technologies, some of them are cheap, some of them are more expensive, but doing that until 2050, and then we should have managed to eradicate malaria. We don't particularly want to eradicate mosquitoes because they're an important part of the food chain, but we should be able to eradicate the disease, the parasite, malaria, by doing that. It's possible, we got rid of polio, mostly. We got rid of smallpox, mostly. It's possible. It just takes international cooperation. It takes internationalism. But then, speaking of anti-vax problems, people think that malaria vaccinations are some kind of attack on poor black and Hispanic nations. It's just not helpful. Trans issues are kind of on my mind after what's happened with ContraPoints. She's now been doxxed. I've written an article on ContraPoints that should go up on trigger warning fairly soon. But a gender identity clinic has accidentally leaked 2,000 patient email addresses. This is the Charing Cross Gender Identity Clinic. And didn't BCC. That's the problem. They CC'd. So they sent all their patients an email about an art competition, but left everyone's email address visible in it. It's a kind of an easy mistake to make, I suppose, but when you're dealing with something this delicate, you really want to be more careful. People are probably going to end up being compensated. An NHS trust that did a similar thing in 2016 was fined about £200,000, if I remember right, and they leaked about 800 patients' details. Of course, the concern is that this will have ended up one way or the other in the hands of bigots or a family that people weren't prepared to come out to, or whatever else. But if you've had gender identity treatment or consultation in London, particularly that Charing Cross area, I'd be careful and I'd check up. There's a new curriculum in Wales for teaching, and it's a bit of a problem because it includes the possibility of teaching creationism, which isn't really something that anyone wants. who cares about science and so on. Um, so David Attenborough and the Humanist Society of the UK wants creationism to be banned from this curriculum. The changes as they stand at the moment increase the possibility of teaching creationism as science. Now, there are charter schools, there are religious schools, and so on. It's nowhere near as bad as it is in the States, but there are schools that teach pseudoscience, that teach creationism, alongside where they're teaching religion. I mean, if your child is... Well, if your family is religious, if you have a particular religion and you want someone to be brought up in that tradition, it's kind of child abuse. But in our society where they're going to be exposed to other points of view and so on, I don't think it's necessarily that bad. You've always got to balance religious freedom versus the problems that religion can cause. But if it stays in its lane, that's fine. When you start teaching creationism in science, or you teach the flaws in evolution rather than evolution itself in biology class, yeah, that's a problem. So I hope there's a success here in the legal challenge, but we don't have separation of church and state here. Oddly, that means we don't have as many problems as the States does with creationism, because I think to an extent familiarity breeds contempt. You know, we've got Church of England schools, we've got Catholic schools, we've got Islamic-based schools, we've got religious schools, right? And we also have, the Queen is the head of the Church of England, so our monarch is also our Pope, if you're Anglican. And there are bishops and so on in the House of Lords that shouldn't be there, but it doesn't cause that much harm. It's just a kind of affront to the dignity of the country, I think. But because there isn't that separation, religions also don't seem to be as free to interfere as they are in the States. And yet that's increased religious militancy in the States, whereas here everyone just kind of doesn't care, which is better in some ways. It's paradoxical, but yeah. Dairylea has been forced to pull some adverts. So there's a rather suggestive advert in which a woman is hit in the head with what appears to be cream or something. It's not as bad as that Finnish advert that looks like a bukkake scene, but still. So they've been forced to pull this advert, not because it's someone getting hit in the face with a pie, but because some children are lactose intolerant. I could kind of see where they were coming from if the complaint was purely other kids are going to imitate this behaviour and it's going to lead to increased bullying. Way back in the mists of time, when dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was still at school, a bunch of adverts came out for Tango. Right, it's a soft drink, right? Mostly orange. I think there's other ones as well. But it had these really surreal adverts with weird characters that kind of represented the supposed experience of drinking a Tango. So it was a guy dressed as Napoleon with his hand under his jacket, and he would come up and pull it out, and there's this big orange rubber glove, and he'd like brrr over your face, right? And there was another one that came up and slaps you on the cheeks. You've been tangoed. Kids, of course, took this up. There was a lot of face slapping, that sort of thing. A couple of kids got their eardrums popped. And so those adverts were withdrawn, or at least they changed what was going on. So it was no longer a naked orange guy slapping you on the cheeks anymore because kids were imitating that. It was other things that were safer. Maybe Dairylea will take that angle. But I just wanted to point it out because people are bound to say that this is just snowflakery bullshit. But I remember when kids were copying adverts and it did cause a problem. I think this whole idea of because people might be allergic to dairy or whatever, that's stupid. But worrying that kids might enter into food fights and so on at school, that seems a lot more likely. Plus, it's a bit suggestive. So maybe not appropriate. The government wants to hold a second vote on an early election. It's unlikely to pass. Now, lots of people are calling Jeremy Corbyn a coward and so on, but just tactically, it's not remotely a good idea to have an election. We need to hold Boris's nose in his own mess and make him face up to it, and hopefully force him to extend everything, extend Article 50, or at least go and beg for one, so that he looks like the hypocrite and fool that he is. Right? And then we'll have an election. And if the election comes after October 31st, then the numbers are just better for the opposition parties. So why would they let him, right? I know Corbyn's been banging on for an election. I've criticised him for that. He should be asking for a referendum, not an election. Maybe if they can tie the two together, we might get an earlier election. We'll see. But yeah, this is so far this is being blocked, and I don't see that changing today. Very little is predictable around Brexit, but I think an early election, at least until after October 31st, we're not going to see one. I don't think that's going to happen at all. I think that's a reasonably safe prediction. But banging on at Corbyn or whoever for it, I mean, politically, tactically, why would you allow an earlier election? Boris is rapidly destroying his own party and eating away at his own support. So why not? Plus, if he extends things, then the Brexit party might still go up against him rather than have a pact with him, because he'll have shown that he's weak on Brexit or whatever else, and that will divide the vote. So, tactically it's sound. God, he looks like someone's first attempt at a sausage. What a twat. But so he still wants to prorogue Parliament, but there is this law now in place, or imminently in place, once he gets royal assent. It's past the Lords, past Parliament, to stop him. Because this is a crisis, and there needs to be proper democratic scrutiny. This goes back to what I was saying about Bercow earlier. But the government is looking to test the very limits of the law, and they still haven't ruled out breaking the law, which means we could see Bojo get arrested, or at least tested in court over this. He looks like a half-hearted, abandoned balloon animal, doesn't he? But yeah, they seem willing to break the law. So much for respecting democracy, so much for respecting the rule of law. They don't care. And this is why MPs continue to flee their party. Twats. Right, I have a work call in a minute, so let's quick look at the comments. Only Ben commenting. Hello, Ben. I'm sure more people will become aware of the channel and subscribe in future. But it's just live streaming was killing the metrics on my other channel. Talking about Tango, he says that was the precursor to happy slapping. Yeah, it was. Now, after Tango, but way before happy slapping came about, we had a thing in my school called spamming, weirdly, because it would then become, what we all think of with email, and that was just slapping someone on the forehead, which, doesn't really hurt. That was our safe version of tangoing. Right, like I said, I got a work call to go and do, so I'm going to have to cut this short. I will see you next week. Inappropriate characters. Think we found a solution. Either using Hangouts separately and streaming it through OBS, if I can get OBS to cooperate next time, or using an online video conference service that just runs through HTML, which Pundit should be able to use. But we shall see. I'll see you all later. Zang.